Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual briefing, Planning for Safety, How Land Use Decisions Shape Flood Risk. I'm Rebecca Eicher, a project director with the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues, also known as the EPI Center. The EPI Center's mission is to build trusted relationships between scientific experts and decision makers at all levels of government, to make it easier for policymakers to access and incorporate scientific evidence into their decision-making processes. Today's briefing is in partnership with our colleagues from the SciPac team, a part of the Science family of journals, and we're very excited to bring together this great set of experts for you all today. I just want to give you a quick review of the agenda. So we're fortunate to have three wonderful panelists who will each give brief presentations, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions, some that I'll ask, and then some that we'll take from the Q&A from all of you. So please do put your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to the ones that we can and have time for. I can't promise we'll get to them all. We are recording this briefing, and it will be posted on the event page in the coming days as soon as we can get it up there. Some of the speakers will have slides. Those slides will also be available, and there will be contact information for all of the panelists. So if you have additional questions or follow-up, they are willing to talk with you. So let's just jump right in so you can hear from this great set of speakers. Our first speaker is A.R. Siders, an associate professor at the University of Delaware in the Disaster Research Center and director of the Climate Change Science and Policy Hub. Also of note, Siders is a researcher who was featured in a special issue of Science, Climate-Induced Relocation, which was published in June 2021. And our colleagues from Science learned what a great resource Siders is for policymakers. And so we're thrilled to have her joining us today. Siders, I welcome you and take it away.
Thanks so much. I'm going to do something a little radical, which is that I am going to speak without slides. So stick with me. I have 5 points I'm going to try to make, which are all about how land use is absolutely critical to thinking about flood risk reduction, long-term adaptation and resilience. So point number 1 is exactly that. It's that land use is key. And specifically, local land use decisions are absolutely the front line of thinking about floodplain management and thinking about flood risk management. Researchers at the University of Delaware did an interesting study looking at future projections of storm damages. And what they found was that land use was 6 times more important for understanding future flood risk, future storm damage, than sea level rise rates, than what storm model you used, than any amount of uncertainty over how much change will happen in the future. It all came down to how many people will live in the floodplain and what will those buildings look like. That was the key. 6 times more important. The reason I think that's so critical is that unlike sea level rise or many global change phenomenon, where the buildings go is something that local communities control. They have an extraordinary amount of control over this if they exercise those powers. They have the power to think about where buildings are added. They have the power to think about where buildings are revised, remodeled. They have the power to unbuild buildings and infrastructure that is already there, to revise, or to step back and do nothing. But they have ultimate control over how many homes are exposed to floodplains. There's a lever that needs to be used. The second point is along this is do not build in floodplains. Stop it. It sounds really simple, but we need to change as a country to default to no. We need to say the default should be do not build in places that we know will flood consistently. Make exceptions to that, earn the exception. Maine sand dune rules have a really good example of this. They make new construction prove that their structure will be safe for the next 75 years without relying on building a new seawall, without relying on some future effort that will be taken and paid for by someone else down the road. They don't allow developers or people who want to build to kick the can, to put responsibility on future generations. They say your responsibility is to prove that this will be a safe place to live or safe place to do business, not just today, but for 30 years, for 50 years. Make exceptions, earn that exception. Don't give out variances like candy. We did a study of floodplain development in towns across the United States and found that there were 844,000 new homes and 2 million acres of open space that was converted to like concrete and impervious surface from 2001 to 2019 in the floodplain, in the FEMA designated 100-year floodplain. That means that over 2 decades, we added 844,000 homes to places that we know have a 1 in 4 chance of flooding before that family finishes paying for the mortgage. That's 844,000 families who are going to potentially have to face that risk, face the financial challenges, the health challenges, the psychological challenges, physical safety, all of that. We do not have a great plan to protect those 844,000 new homes. So we need to think about that. Now, if anyone here is from Florida, don't cheer or mention it in the chat. Half of those homes were built in Florida. So that's a thing. I'm just going to leave that there. The surprise we found was that actually nationally, most towns don't build in the floodplains, at least not as much as you'd expect them to, given the size of their floodplains and the number of new homes they're building. We actually found that 75% of towns in the United States are building less in the floodplain than you'd expect, given the size of that floodplain. Now, that still means that they could be doing better, right? You can hear the caveat, they're doing better than expected. It doesn't mean they're not building in the floodplain at all. It just means they're putting a lower percent than you'd expect, given that size. So we can still do better. But that means 75% of towns are taking action. We looked at we looked at New Jersey. New Jersey is a state with really high development pressures, not a lot of open space to develop. So they're trying to add new housing. They're trying to figure out where that goes. And they get an extraordinary amount of their local property, their local government funding from property tax revenue. So they have a really high incentive to develop, even if it's flood prone. We actually found that 85% of towns in New Jersey were building less than you'd expect. Still, New Jersey is ranked one of the top states for building in the floodplain because the towns that are building in the floodplain were building up to 6 times more in the floodplain than you'd expect, given the size of their floodplain. Now, that means that they're looking at all of the open space in their town and they're saying, you know what we should do is we should double down in the place where we know it will flood. Yeah. And when you aggregate that up over a state, it makes the whole state look as though the state is putting all of its homes in the floodplain, but it's not. It's 15% of towns. I think this is really important because there's a narrative out there that says, oh, everyone builds in the floodplain. Of course we build in the floodplain. Where else could you build except in the floodplain? And the answer is actually lots of places. And most people don't build in the floodplain. But for some reason, we have accepted that this is an okay behavior. And actually, maybe it's not. Instead of asking what people are doing really right when not building a floodplain, maybe we should be asking, what are they doing wrong in these places that are doubling down in the floodplain? Why is that happening? Why are we allowing that to happen? Because when we asked, how are these towns doing it? How are they managing to avoid it? One of the planners came back and just said, it's nothing special. And in fact, what we found is that the towns that were doing really well just enforced their laws. They had a couple zoning laws, they had some pretty standard laws on the books, and they just enforced them. They didn't give out tons of variances. They didn't allow tons of permitting exceptions. They didn't allow businesses to push them around or developers to bribe them into letting them build in the floodplain anyway. They just said, no, that's a flood-prone area that we have designated for not building, and you're not going to build there. That's it. That's what they did. I've started to think about this as the eating your veggies story, because we were looking for the silver bullet. We were looking for the magic fix. We were looking for the diet pill that would let someone do better. But the ultimate answer at the end of the day was the towns that are doing really, really well just do the hard work every single day. And it's not glamorous and it's not exciting and it doesn't show up on anyone's best practices because it is so routine that it doesn't show up on anyone's radar. But the answer is routine land use decisions made every day at the local level are what are driving flood risk in the United States. And that's why local action is so key. And on some level, that's a positive story because it means the solution isn't some crazy law that's going to be hard to adapt. It doesn't require a lot of funding. It doesn't involve tons of investments. It just requires a department to commit and to have the political will to commit to that over the long term. And that is challenging. I'm not suggesting that's not challenging, but it's a different set of challenges than we face. So I'm going to share a link in the chat in a few moments, which is a link to a map and a data set where if you want to look up your town and how much of your town is developing in the floodplain, you can see that. And if you find that your town is building a lot in the floodplain, maybe you should ask, why is your town choosing to build in the floodplain? Because they almost certainly could stop it, but they're choosing not to. Why are they doing that? And who's benefiting from it? All right, point number 3, property tax revenue is not a good excuse. We use it as a good excuse all the time. We say, oh, of course, we're building the floodplain because we need the property tax revenue. But I want to reframe this question for you. The problem we're trying to solve is not how do you maintain property tax revenue in a place that is facing massive challenges and maybe shrinking housing. The challenge is how do you sustainably fund local governments? That's a different problem. They're related, but if you frame the problem as how do we sustainably fund local government and services, you have a whole host of other solutions that do not involve building homes in places where you know they will flood. So we have a lot more opportunities if we reframe that problem and think more creatively about alternate sources of funding, alternate sources of sustaining our governments. And we're going to have to start thinking creatively about how those funding issues are, given all of the funding changes that are happening in the landscape right now. So we're going to have to start thinking creatively and not relying on the past systems that we've had in order to keep going in the future. Related to this is issue number 4, capacity. We have to build state and local capacity. Some states and some local governments are great. They have expert flood managers. They've got GIS experts. They've got grant analysts. They have a staff of planning officials who are thinking about all these issues and thinking long term. And then there are other towns, maybe some of you are from them, where there's one person who works part-time and is also a local school teacher. There's a community in North Carolina where the emergency management official is also the animal control officer. They're juggling multiple jobs, right? I work with places where it's one planner who works with 4 towns because they're on a part-time basis, for each of them. That person isn't going to have the same bandwidth. Those towns aren't going to have the same capacity. They're going to have a much more difficult time, longer time getting those plans in place, enforcing those plans, applying for grants, applying for assistance. And I think this is where states are really going to need to step up. We're going to need a lot more state investment in providing technical assistance, in providing personnel assistance, timing, providing support for capacity building to ensure that we don't just have communities with haves and have-nots. We already do. We have lots of communities with haves and have-nots in terms of this capacity, but that is going to become even more apparent as we lose federal protection and federal money. That is going to become more obvious, and we're going to need states to step into that role and work on capacity building really explicitly. That's going to be an issue. And then finally, the 5th point I want to make here is that adaptation often gets talked about as though it's a one-time thing. We're going to do the flood risk management study. We're going to invest in the seawall. We're going to do flood risk, and then it's going to be fine, as though then now we've solved the issue. And of course, as soon as I say that, all of you know that that's ridiculous, right? That's a straw man I'm putting out there. But we really need to rethink the way we think about flood resilience, flood risk reduction, and adaptation. All of these are ongoing processes. I think I've been thinking a lot about dieting, and I always make dieting analogies here, but it's the difference between thinking you can go on a crash diet and solve the problem, or thinking you can go on, to one time to the gym and solve the issue. Whereas what you actually need to do is eat your veggies every single day, go for long walks, right? Change your lifestyle. If we actually want to address flood risk in the United States and address these issues, we can't think about one-time investments. We can't think about one-time actions. We have to think about committing to long-term, systematic, systems-level change in a way that is going to enable this. And that starts at the local level. That starts with daily decisions about where development is permitted. That starts about decisions around where was building permitted in the past and maybe needs to be unbuilt. And when we think about that kind of unbuilding, it doesn't have to mean we force people out of their homes today. It could mean we think about that over the next century, right? If you start thinking about the next century and think about how your town has changed in the last century, it's going to change an equal amount in the future. There's so much opportunity over that next century to do more things. Spreading out that process provides opportunities for processes that are more fair, that have more participation in them, that create really amazing visions. But it requires us to commit to that kind of long-term change. And that is going to be the challenge moving forward. So those are my 5 big points. The local governments are absolutely key. Building their capacity is really non-negotiable. If we want them to be the front lines of flood risk management, we have to build more government capacity at the local levels and in more local communities. We have to stop building in the floodplains, seriously. Right, it's the old joke that the first step when you find yourself in a pit is to stop digging. Yeah, we have to stop digging before we're going to get ourselves out. We've got to work on that. In order to do that, I think we have to ditch the property tax excuse. And we have to start thinking more creatively about the bigger picture goal, which is sustainable funding sources for local government services, for provision of services to people. And that's going to be part of us thinking about adaptation as an ongoing process, something that is a daily habit that we get into rather than a one-time fix. And that's my time. Thanks.
Thank you. What a fantastic opportunity to learn more about land use planning strategies and implementing these for risk reduction. Really great. Thank you, Siders. I'm thrilled to welcome our next speaker, Kay Atoba, an associate research scientist at the Institute for a Disaster Resilient Texas at Texas A&M University. Kay has done a lot of community engagement and working and building relationships with scientists and communities, and we're thrilled to hear from you today. Welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here to share some of my work. I want to talk a little bit more on land use now, and to build on some of the things that Siders have talked about on how we make land use decisions, but particularly how we can actually bridge the gap between the amazing research that we do in the academic community and those that actually make land use decisions, and provide some practical insights and examples from some of the work that I have done with our institute here in Texas. And so in the next slide, as you can see here, we can talk primarily about hazard mitigation as a part of land use, where we are thinking about how we can evaluate specific mitigation measures. For example, buyouts and property acquisition, where we're trying to remove properties from flood risk or flood-prone areas. And that's very common and popular in the United States right now. Freeboard, which is pretty much adding the extra layers of elevation to be able to enable properties to be taken out of the floodplain, so that way they can actually record reduced flood impacts as a result of extreme events. And then we also have nature-based solutions as an example of mitigation strategies for areas that are prone to flood risk. And then when we think about the other aspect of risk assessment also, we think about how communities create hazard mitigation plans, which is required by law if you want to get federal funding, to tell us about how the policies you're putting in place and how you plan to mitigate the results of the different hazards that you face, and the infrastructure and how you can actually measure impact on the community. So these are different types of research that have been carried out. Really a lot of scholarly work has been done in this area. But the challenge that we usually have in the academic community is actually how we get our work as researchers and as modelers to decisions, policymaking and decision support. And so how are we able to support state agencies that actually make land use decisions and policy decisions, support local planners, for example, on how they can implement some of the things, for example, that Siders talked about, like reduce or limit or eliminate building in the floodplain, for example. And there are a lot of other local non-governmental organizations and other agencies that are really interested in taking the data that has been, the data and the analytics and the models that have been built to be able to help communities make great, important land use decisions. So I want to provide some examples as based on some of the work that we've done with the community locally here in Texas. The first example I'd like to provide is in our next slide here, and is primarily on how we make post-buyout land use decisions. And so typically when a property has been bought out or acquired, it depends on, you can use different terms. Primarily properties in the floodplain are acquired and returned to vacant open space. So that way they will not be recording flood damages in the future. Usually what happens is FEMA provides these grants to homeowners, volunteers that accept the buyout. They demolish the structure and it's just a vacant open space. Now that is problematic because it's a reactive approach, because at the end of the day, of course, that property would not experience losses in perpetuity into the future. But what happens to that land? Local communities are taxed with maintaining the property, for example, the land. They have to mow it, they have to clean the trash, and so many other things. And these are challenges that a lot of communities are facing. And so what we decided to do was to do some more research on looking at the eligibility criteria, look at the data on where the buyout properties are in Harris County, Texas, and then identify viable properties that can be bought out in the future or maintained for additional flood mitigation measures. And this is where a local nonprofit organization called Houston Wilderness that we partnered with comes in. They have a program called the Riverine Targeted Use of Buyouts Program, which is a region-wide approach where they are trying to increase land use, improve land use, and improve vacant open space, but primarily implementing green stormwater infrastructure on these buyout lands that ideally would just lay fallow and vacant. But how about we increase the ecological value of these properties, of this land? And so what they did was identify, based on the analysis that we provided, getting our data to the hands of practitioners, identify viable areas that will benefit from the use of GSIs, for example, the planted trees, as you can see on that sample site, one of the about 25 locations they currently have in Harris County. Sample established trees, for example, close to parks. Bioswales are also another examples of nature-based solutions that could be used, or even reestablished riparian areas, wetlands. And so what we're seeing is they're trying to annex riparian areas, bayous, and rivers to existing buyout properties. So that way, these buyout land can actually serve as stormwater infrastructure instead of just laying fallow. And so not just the fact that they're actually getting grants to plant on these properties and build green stormwater infrastructure, but also they're doing so many things to engage the community. If you look at our next slide, for example, you see some of the things that Houston Wilderness has done, where they're actually able to get their hands on actually implementing some of this nature-based solutions. On the top left there, you see an example of a bioswale that has been planted already. And you can see a little bit close to the left there where you have the water, the bayou already. And so we're thinking about using this land post-buyout for improving water quality and also ensuring that as a bioswale, as a nature-based solution, can actually increase or improve stormwater storage. And on the top right there, you also see how they're engaging community members. These are actually volunteers that are planting the bioswales and implementing the bioswales. And this really helps with making this cost efficient. And on the bottom left there, also what you see is a part of educating the community, helping them to see with a sign that there's a bioswale here. And they're doing this across several locations and covering several acres of properties and helping to install stormwater infrastructure. And this is not just a benefit to the community, the research to the local community. The research community is also benefiting from this because we're able to identify additional research opportunities. At the bottom right there, you see one of our PhD students taking some samples for soil infiltration. What we realize is after implementing these nature-based solutions on the site, can we actually measure how they're performing? What we're doing here is collecting samples to see actually how this site actually improving water storage and see whether they're actually performing better than when the land was vacant. And so these are opportunities that benefit both the local community and also the research community. The next example I would like to highlight there on the next slide here is another program that we worked with called the Digital Risk Infrastructure Program. This was actually funded by the Texas State Legislature, where we're able to actually go to the communities and ask them what really they want. As researchers, we usually just go and tell the communities that we're here to solve all your problems. Whereas we really don't listen to the communities. And when we go there, we realized that the better approach is actually to ask, what do you really want? And inform our research to fit that. And so what you see on the left, bottom left, is an example of us printing very basic maps. Sometimes all they just want is a map. And these are all under-resourced communities. We have a lot of them in West Texas, where they actually do not have the data. And they deal with some of the challenges that Cyrus mentioned about one person serving multiple roles. And so what we're seeing is that we're engaging these communities. We're actually getting them to go on out and collect data on their phones. We train them, and then they bring that data for us to do some analytics on. That doesn't sit on the shelf on just a peer-reviewed journal article, but actually the community can lay their hands on and use it for flood mitigation and land use decisions. We see, if you look at the next testimonial there, we have a quote from one of the people that participated in this. This is Cody Powell. And what he did say is that they were appreciative the fact that we brought the data to the community and asked them how they want to use the data. And I'll ask how it can actually benefit the community. Next here is also another thing I really want to talk about in our next slide on how we can convert data to decision making. And so this is an example of how we've done this at our institute here in Texas A&M, where we created a disaster information system. And the goal is actually to get the data from the hands of the consultants that build all these different grid models into the hands of the people. One of the ones I want to highlight there is the one on the right called Bias Aware. And I'm going to provide that resource for you all. The website is actually there where you can identify your flood risk and wildfire risk. It gives you a detailed report, and you actually see options, mitigation options at the parcel level as to what your risk is before you buy a property. If you decide to buy the property after knowing that that property has flooded or the area has flooded historically, then how are you going to mitigate the effect of this if you really love the house and the property, or you really want to live in the area? And so what we're doing is providing that information to decision makers, which in this case could be individuals or even real estate developers or agents that want to better understand flood risk. The next example I'd also like to highlight is on the next slide, which is another program that we actually are just really finishing up. On the next slide here, what you see is the risk assessment and mapping portal. And so this is one of the ways in which we support a local state agency where they're able to we're able to actually first help with the risk assessment portion of their hazard mitigation plan, but also after creating that important policy document, how can we get the data and the mapping to the hands of local decision makers? And so what you see here is an example of a tool that we created where just with an internet access, you can actually create some easy maps and download those maps and tables and figures and just take that and import it, because it's already been vetted, directly into your local hazard mitigation plan. And this really helps to reduce the impact, to reduce the pressure of having to get or hire people to do this. Plus, we have people in under-resourced communities that do not have access to sophisticated data and software to actually do this mapping and have access to this data. So we really need to get this data to the hands of the people that use it. And that's the final example I'd like to mention. If you look at our next slide, I'm just going to summarize real quick some of the things I talked about. I realize I'm running out of time. In our next slide, what you see is some of the things that we've learned. We're seeing that we need to listen and we need to learn and look at closely at the challenges that local communities face and learn to see what they also want to prioritize. Next, here, we're also seeing how we can actually convert the problems that they have to opportunities. If they realize that they have a debt of flood risk data, how can we create opportunities for them? Next also is one of the things they can do, which is to show value and help them to see that the research and academic community actually has value and really wants to support them. And finally, we're also seeing from our engagement that we really need to think about how we tell the story. The narrative matters, because these programs that we've created are actually scalable and can actually be expanded, but it's all depends on how we tell the story to the people that would need it the most. So hopefully you picked a few things from how we've actually been able to engage local governments and NGOs and state agencies. And I'm more than happy to take questions and talk a little bit more after this. Thank you.
Thank you. This was fantastic and really great to see some specific examples of the work that you and your colleagues are doing. So thank you. We're excited to have you answer some more questions once we move to that spot. Our last speaker is Amanda Lefevre, who served as the Deputy Commissioner of the Kentucky Department for Environmental Protection since 2020. I saw Amanda talking about some of the work they've been doing in Kentucky, and I thought she needed to join to share all that they're doing. And we all know that Kentucky has experienced a number of devastating floods and many other natural hazards. So we're really excited to hear about the work that you're doing to help folks in Kentucky and what we can do in the rest of the country. Thanks, Amanda.
Great. Thank you all. And thank you for joining us this afternoon, and appreciate you all taking a little bit of time to hear us talk about some of the research and some of the activities going on around flooding. And today I'm going to talk to you about two initiatives in Kentucky. One is our high grounds communities, which is more of a land use type of scenario, and then some of the mapping that we're doing to enable us to make better decisions as policymakers, because I'm much more on the policymaker side of things, although I work with scientists every day. So if we can roll to the next slide. As Rebecca mentioned, flooding is a big issue in Kentucky. Not only is there's lots of property damage and things like that, but we lose a lot of lives in Kentucky. We have 1% of the population, but we account for 5% of the flooding deaths. And just from 2020, we've had 45 deaths in our large Eastern Kentucky floods in the 2022 event during the summer. And even this year, we've had a couple major flooding events that we've had to deal with, and we've had a loss of life. So that's our goal, is to not have a loss of life. Property damage, of course, is it's horrible, but it's that loss of life that really impacts people in their communities. So next slide, please. So we'll start out what precipitated all this. July 28th, 2022, we had 10 to 14 inches of rain in our Eastern Kentucky mountainous region. And the terrain there, it's all mountains and valleys, and that's where people live, in the valleys. So we had steep terrain, wet soils that would not absorb water, and record rainfall. And that resulted in those 45 deaths. It washed out lots of roads and bridges. So we couldn't even access people after the flooding event. Drinking water and clean water facilities were wiped out for months on end. We had 542 homes destroyed, 8,000 damaged. For first few days, of course, we were trying to help people with their basic needs to get them food, shelter, all those necessities, and get FEMA in to start those processes. But after that initial swath of getting people set and back where they at least had the necessities in life, where do you go from there? So next slide, please. Eastern Kentucky already had a housing shortage, even before the flooding. So good housing was hard to come by. The housing stock wasn't that great in some cases. But people are very, very connected to their land and their communities in Eastern Kentucky. We have people who lived in these areas for, generations. So there's that want to stay in a community, to stay, and support their local economies, and to be where their, ancestors have been from. So we tried to think of ways, how could we build back better? How can we, facilitate people wanting to stay in their communities and make them better? But also make it safe, because we want everyone to be in a safe area. So state agencies actually took on the role of being property developers. We work collectively. Governor Beshear decided, we need to move people up to safe high ground. So he tasked all of his agencies to work together collaboratively to develop high ground communities. So this is multiple state and federal agencies that we worked with collaboratively to get this done. So even on the state level, you're looking at, Kentucky DEP, your environmental protection, transportation, local government, finance, public protection, Kentucky emergency management, and then nonprofit agencies. Really started to meet together to try to get this effort off the ground. And I will say this has been a learning as we go, because we all have little pockets of expertise, but it takes all of us working together to get this accomplished. So that takes, it's big lifts in environmental, big lifts in funding, and infrastructure, of course, building roads and, getting infrastructure on these high ground sites continue to be our big lifts. Next slide. So we collectively found 5 large sites that we're working with, although we have smaller sites that we work with nonprofits to also develop accessory housing and things like that. But we've identified at least 5 sites. They have sufficient acreage where we can build 10 to 140 lots on all of the different sites that we have identified. All of them, for the most part, are former mine sites. So they've been donated, or I think we have purchased one site, but most have been donated to us for use for housing. We've selected those initial 5 sites. And like I said, other nonprofits that we're working with, we've also assisted them in developing sites in other places across Eastern Kentucky. Next slide. Thus far, like I said, we've had 5 high ground communities that we've started building. We've have houses built on at least 2 sites. Thompson Branch, which you see there at the bottom, is a fully completed site. It doesn't have as many homes on it, but it's the first project that we've gotten completed. We're also working on infrastructure on those other sites, and we're putting up houses as money comes available. And we're using everything from CDBG, funding from our infrastructure, from our legislature, USDA, rural development, disaster recovery. So there's multiple funding pots with a whole bunch of different, if you've ever worked with federal money, there's all sorts of different caveats and requirements. So we're working through all of that. Our bureaucracies are working through bureaucracies to get this done. So it's a big learning lift for all of us. I will say that, we continue to look for funding partners as we go to continue to develop these houses. We've got people, from the initial flooding events in 2022 to the ones in that just lost houses in February that are in these houses that we're building. So one thing that we actually worked with FEMA to do, typically they do temporary housing, but in this case, our governor worked with them, and we've sort of got a new model here in that they changed their design of some of the that temporary housing they usually build to make it a little bit more sustainable, a little bit more durable, and turn it into a longer use home. So we worked with federal partners to look at new ways of doing things, in terms of providing these homes on these sites. So it's been a heavy lift. We're still continuing to do it. We do weekly meetings to continue moving these things along. And like I said, putting infrastructure in, financing for that has been some of the biggest lift. But these are places where people can move to, can have houses on that will not flood into the future. So truly moving people out of those floodplains and into higher ground where they continue to live in those communities and be part of their Eastern Kentucky home. So, but with all of this, how can we do better here and elsewhere? So something that we've been doing since 2017, and we'll switch to the next slide here, is working on flood mapping. Of course, mapping helps us as decision makers make better decisions. So one of the things that we were able to do, we were working with our cabinet of our Commonwealth Office of Technology, is we had FEMA funding, and we actually used that. We gave our Office of Technology about $200,000, and they leveraged money from Department of Local Government and a couple other Kentucky agencies, and we did LIDAR mapping of the entire state. The entire state, I believe they call it from Kentucky from above. So we were able to do LIDAR mapping of the entire state. And better terrain data equals better maps. So we've been working with contractors since 2014, 2015, somewhere in there, to work on hydraulic 2D modeling for watersheds. So it's sort of flood mapping but it much more accurate. So, the 1D modeling, it could be plus or minus several feet, off. But with this 2D modeling and the hydraulic modeling, it's plus or minus 2 to 3 inches of error. So it's a much more accurate picture of what happens with water as a flooding inundation occurs. So it not only takes into account like the terrain, the ground and things like that, and the river channel, but also the built environment and, the entire watershed and how water moves throughout that watershed and, with all of the items and, built environment and natural environment within that watershed as well. Next slide. So if you look at this, and this is not all the, this will sort of mess you up because it's not the exact same place that's, it's not the same map, but it's just examples of the maps. But, in the top left, you see the 1D, steady state hydraulic model and the river channel. But what our modeling does is it puts a grid, right underneath that over the LiDAR data and the ground data. And within each of those cells, it determines how water will move within that little area, and it will produce a model, which is on the right, which shows you how water will move in a flooding event. And you can see, the hydraulic, the 1D is basically one direction, it's in the river channel, it's here. But even, with our 2D modeling, you can see the whirls of the water and which way it'll move once, flooding reaches that point. So you can see it's a much more dynamic model, and you get a better idea of how water will behave in flooding events. Next slide. And, where the rubber meets the road in our flooding earlier this year, this is actually Frankfurt, the city I'm sitting in today. And you can see the 2013 black and white flood map, and the 2017 model, which we did based on LiDAR data. And, the red arrows indicate the courthouse property. And you can see in 2013 modeling, it didn't even show it in the 100-year floodplain, but with our new enhanced modeling, you can see that it is firmly within that 100-year floodplain. So, we are able to better and more accurately, predict where water will be. Unfortunately, this is a fairly newly, they remodeled and reconstructed that. So unfortunately, it's a new courthouse and it flooded. So, but we think they probably used the old flooding maps when designing as well, unfortunately. So next slide. And the truth of any map, of course, is ground truthing afterward. And we go out and, in USGS, ground truths after flooding events. So this is actually our governor. And if you see that little red arrow, that's actually that's where he's standing roundabout on Wapping Street here in Frankfurt. So that's him, staring, directly down the street at some of the floodwaters and fairly accurately predicting where that water will be. Unfortunately, it's, this is what happened to us back in February, but, if anything, we can see that our modeling actually works. So once again, those better maps really help us make better decisions. And I'll say that if you go to the next slide, I have a link to our water risk portal. So you can look at Kentucky's maps. These are non-regulatory maps, by the way. These are not the FEMA floodplain maps, but we do make these available to our citizens, to policymakers who, want to obviously use them to, make better planning decisions for the future. So if you want to know more about floodplain mapping, Sean Hokinson in our Division of Water is the main contact, along with Casey Carter, and my contact's on the next slide. So here endeth my presentation. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Amanda. That was really informative. And I think there are a fair number of specific questions about Kentucky's approach in the chat, in the Q&A. And so I don't know that we'll get to all our questions, but I had prepared a question. So I'd like to welcome Kay and Siders to join us on camera so we can get right into the discussion. We had talked about a question that I think there's a similar question in the chat about this, and I think you each have some perspective. So how do shifts in federal resources and federal support, like changes at FEMA's ability to respond, how is this going to impact states and local communities in their preparedness, including land use planning and response? Siders, I thought we could start with you since you have worked with federal agencies as well as states and communities, and it really lines up with some of your work and talking points. So if you have any thoughts to share about this shift in federal support, we welcome your comments on that.
Thanks. I'm going to try to find, I'm going to try and choose my words here. The shift in federal policy right now is actually one that has been, maybe not the way it's being implemented, but the idea of shifting more responsibility for disaster prevention and response to state and local governments has been going on for several administrations over the last at least decade. There were moves in 2012, 2014, even, and then beyond, basically every other year since then. So it's not necessarily a new thing, although I think what we're seeing right now is a really dramatic and a really fast shift. And it's intended to put more responsibility on state and local governments. And so on some level, that's what it's going to do. There's no longer going to be a question of where's FEMA. The question is going to be, where is the state emergency management agency? Where is the local emergency management agency or response? And for a while, sorry, I'm going to try and talk shortly, but for a little while, people were talking about gap disasters. So disasters that affected a community and hurt a community, but were not large enough to become a FEMA problem. And there are going to be many, many, many more disasters that fall into that category that are not large enough to get federal response. And the federal response might be smaller than it has been in the past. So the options there, to sort of paraphrase the what do you do about climate change, you mitigate, you adapt, or you suffer, the options here are that state and local governments are going to step up, that the private sector is going to step up, or that people are going to suffer. And I am really rooting for number one or two. So I really hope we proactively take as much action as we can now for that.
Well, and I think, Amanda, coming from a state that has been dealing with this, many hazards and challenges like flooding, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, because July 2022 was unfortunately not our first big rodeo when it came to, in December of 2021, we had, 120 plus mile long track tornado. So, we unfortunately cut our teeth with FEMA, and, we've always used disaster response from FEMA and stuff like that, but that was the first real big one. And then you had a second one on its heels. You really become well versed in what you are good at and what you're not good at. So what I fear, there's lots of question marks around federal funding, and FEMA is just one area of federal funding and state agency control, right? So, there's lots of deregulation, not deregulation, but, handing off of things to the state in lots of different areas, and that's going to stretch our dollars. So, it's not just one area that we're going to have to take on more responsibility or a higher, amount of burden. So what I'm concerned about is it's going to dilute our ability to do what we've done in previous flooding and tornado events and disaster events. So, that support is really critical. Not only, because it's not only on the ground, but that planning piece too. Our flood mapping is heavily, FEMA based. So they help support that, and that helps, citizens prepare. So, with that shift in funding, and shifts everywhere across the board, across all of government, it really becomes a, what do you respond to first? And, what we've been able to do in the past. And, we've been fairly effective, I think, in, reacting to storm events. But unfortunately, we've gotten sort of, I don't want to say good at it, but, we've definitely know what we need to do when. But I'm afraid that will continue, that will get stretched and our abilities will not be there. So that's my big fear, because it's across the board, multiple areas. So.
Yeah, thanks. And Kay, I think you have had some experience working with Texas as a state, as well as some of the communities. And there's even a question in here about some creative ways to sustainably fund local governments and adaptation efforts. So you mentioned some NGOs. I don't know if you could elaborate a little bit more on your experience at the local level.
Yes, so NGOs are great examples. The one I cited, the Houston Wilderness, for example, what they do is they have a mandate. They have a way in which the goal is actually to improve land use in the locally, but they do the work of going to seek out the funding. I know a lot of their projects are funded by the NIFWIF grants, by Texas, by Wildlife. And a lot of those grants, for example, actually give them monies to implement some of those nature-based solutions on the ground. And even talking with those NGOs, for example, they've had conversations even with local residents that are local residents, other NGOs that are actually willing to even fund small-scale type projects. Private donors, for example, also create opportunities to fund those kind of projects for making some of those land use decisions. So those NGOs really do a good job trying to seek out innovative ways to find funding for this. And one of the things they also do is they have existing relationships with local agencies like the flood control districts. And those also have certain strategies or ways in which they can talk to city officials to move funds around so as to be able to prioritize certain mitigation efforts. So in the communities try to figure this out. But this is going to be for primarily communities that have the resources. We're seeing that for under-resourced communities, funding will always be a challenge. And that is why I'm also worried about issues with, especially now that we're moving things from the state, federal, we're thinking about moving funding and how it is being dispersed and the management of it to the state level and the local level. These local communities are going to have issues with capacity and capacity in terms of even identifying how the funding will be dispersed and how where they can source the funding and how they can use it. So I think capacity is going to be a big problem, primarily for some of those under-resourced communities. And that's something that we really need to think about or task the state agencies to figure out the best way to address local communities that have very limited capacity for funding.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I also saw in the chat what might be a thought exercise. Do you expect that future demographic trends this century, population growth slowing and even topping out, will ameliorate pressures to build in floodplain areas? Or how do you think shifting demographics might impact floodplain development? Anybody can step up on that one.
I love thought exercises and trying to imagine the future. I think this one's really tricky. We haven't seen a decrease in demand. I think for a long time people thought we would see a decrease in demand as flooding got worse and hurricanes got worse and we saw more frequent flooding, and we haven't. So that's been intriguing. I think also right now the fact that we have such a housing crisis means that maybe first what we're going to see is a slight decrease in the housing crisis and some issues on the housing. I don't know. Yeah. So on some level, I almost think the shrinking demographic might mean that we just have less of a housing crisis. I'm not sure if it's going to influence where people want to live. I don't think it will mean they don't want to live on the coast. It just might mean that we have less development pressure overall. But I think the reasons people are building on the coast usually are because someone's making money. not because it's the only place you can put housing, right? So I'm not sure that I'm not sure it's the population size that's driving it so much as the amenities and the desire, at least in most places today. But that's more anecdotal and less data driven than I'd like to give as an answer. Yeah.
Yeah, and Amanda, I think maybe also thinking about what's happening in Kentucky and the program, the High Ground program, you know, how are communities responding? What does that look like in terms of engagement, and why is it going to be a success? Also, before you get to that, I do want to say, the speakers, citers, Kay, have been putting answers to your questions in the answered questions. So there's a lot of links in there and resources. We will download all of that and share it with you, but I did want you to know it's there. So Amanda, how's the response in Kentucky looking around shifting demographics, and what do you think the communities will respond?
So, in Eastern Kentucky, we want to maintain our demographics because Eastern Kentucky's experienced a lot of loss of population. So for us, it's stabilizing our community there and stabilizing a workforce that could be reliable in the future as we, look at bringing different industry, different, employment opportunities to Eastern Kentucky. So in terms of what we're doing there, it is really just trying to, give people a safe place to be and live and remain in that area without that question of flooding. And I will say, I know I have a High Ground video that I need to put in the chat as well. I forgot to do that, just talk about that when I was, gives a little bit more information about what we're doing. But, so in a lot of ways, Eastern Kentucky, we're just trying to maintain. It's not necessarily a matter of, slowing down growth or anything like that. We want to make sure that, we have people there, for years to come that want to be there. So, and we're really, really engaged with the communities and working with like the locals and, trying to meet their needs and working, diligently to, make sure that we're, communicating with everybody and making sure that the area development districts, the mayors, the judge executives are on board, and we're making sure we're talking with citizens and getting everybody engaged with that. So
Yeah. And Amanda, we did put the link to that in the chat.
great.
Yeah, this is a resource that Kentucky has just released. And Kay, any final thoughts on shifting populations and movements of communities? And we're getting to the top of the hour, so we're almost done. So
Thoughts primarily is just going to be to I think we need to keep working on improving the data and understanding where the shifts are actually occurring. For some communities, it's definitely going to be a problem, but we do have, and just thinking locally, we do have a lot of communities in Texas that's really not a concern, right? So they're actually losing population in some of these rural areas. But for areas where it is a concern, I think besides us mentioned one key point, enforcing land use decision making. We really need to think about it, and we need to get people that make decisions to think more about it and actually enforce these things. Houston for example, after Hurricane Harvey, there are a couple of really, really high standard floodplain development restrictions, which we have a PhD student currently looking at actually whether those restrictions after Harvey in 2017 are being implemented. But on the other side, we've had a huge population increase also in Texas. So I think that's an ongoing question that we need to start looking at the data and see actually what that means and where the trends are going.
thank you. I'm going to give each of you about 15 seconds for your final closing thoughts, like a radio host here. But before we do that, I want to plug, we always do evaluations of our events because we want to hear what worked, what you learned, what we could do more of. So we have in the chat the link to the survey, and it will come up again when this closes. We're a science-based organization. We use science to inform our decisions about what kind of policymaker briefings you want to hear. So fill it out so we can do more of these. And with that, I'll say, Amanda, do you want to start with just a few closing thoughts on Kentucky's efforts and what other states might be able to learn from what's happening in Kentucky?
Well, I think we can always do better. Whatever we're doing now, we can always go the next step. So we're learning as we go along. I will say that if anybody has any questions today, please reach out to me. I'm not great on the flood map, so that's my technical people, but there are contacts in there too. So I'd be happy to talk to anybody and share stories. And, you know, I think we all do better when we talk and exchange ideas. So.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks for being available. Siders,
you.
any final?
I guess I know you bought time, and I really should have had better thoughts put together here. But it's a long game, right? So we have to play the long game. We have to be committed to the long game, and it feels like a sprint because every disaster season feels like a sprint, and it is, and we have to work on that. But on some level, we have to keep in mind the long game and keep in mind that every seemingly small decision we make really adds up over time. So every single home that is built, every single floodplain decision is made really adds up over time. So try and keep that in mind. And I don't know, go do good work. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And then Kay, anything from Texas?
Yeah, I was at Texas. Everything is big in Texas. There's a lot going on here in Texas in terms of data collection for flood risk management. Feel free to check out our website, IDRT website, and the Water Development, Texas Water Development Board is doing great. And so we're doing a lot of learning. And I must say, I cited some examples, but I think the key point is to make sure that we're continuing to engage. I know we have a lot of practitioners here. When members of the academic community and the research community come, let's engage with them and see how we can mutually benefit from each other, because there's a lot in the scientific community that's not making it down to the local level. And we really need to do better as researchers to help them see the value of the work that we do and actually help them to make better decisions.
Wonderful. Well, we really appreciate the three of you taking the time today, and we thank everybody who joined us. A recording will be available. We'll post it. We'll share it. We'll thank you for coming via email, and we'll give you all the links. So thank you again to our speakers and everyone who joined us. Have a good rest of your day.